Welcome everybody. As people are trickling in here, my name is Clint Boyd. I am another paleontologist with the North Dakota Geological Survey. I work with Becky. I serve as the curator, so I oversee the collections and all the work we're doing here and making sure everything runs smoothly. Today, we are going to talk about saber-toothed cats. That's our topic for today. Who's excited about saber-toothed cats? Raise your hand. A few people I can see. There we go. There's hands going up. All right. So saber-toothed cats, you know, most people know what a modern cat is, right? We've got this little fluffy cat here. This is my daughter's stuffed cat that I brought in. Its name is Fluffy. So most people are familiar with cats. Some of you will have cats at home. A lot of you probably have at least stuffed animals of cats. And we're going to talk about some of the most interesting cats that have ever lived, the saber-toothed cats. Today, we're going to talk about saber-toothed cats. You can still see me up in the corner up here, but we're going to be paying attention to the screen, and I can point around with the mouse and you can see the stuff that I'm pointing to. So everybody pay attention. So cats are in a group known as FELIDAE. That's the family that includes all living cats. And you can see here on this slide, here's a bunch of different types of cats. We've got cougars, we've got sand cats, which are these adorable little cats from Africa, lions and tigers and jaguars. What's everybody's favorite cat? If you've got a favorite type of cat, go ahead and throw it into the chat log and just let us know what your favorite cat is. So these are the animals that we're going to talk about today. Now, there are also a group of animals that are known as the cat-like carnivores. Carnivores are animals that eat meat, and the big group of animals that mostly eat meat, like bears and dogs and cats and hyenas, we throw into a group that we call carnivora. And we divide that between the cat-like carnivores and the dog-like carnivores. So on the cat-like side, we have a few animals that you probably haven't heard of, like the Asiatic linsang, African palm civet, but then we have some animals that you probably are familiar with, like hyenas. Hyenas are very closely related to cats. A lot of people like to think of them as more dog-like, but they're actually more closely related to cats. And then also mongooses. Mongooses are also very closely related to cats. So that's our cat-like side of the tree here. And what we're going to talk about today are saber-toothed cats. And it turns out that when we say saber-toothed cats, we're actually talking about more than one type of animal. So real quick, I am going to make this window bigger. So when we talk about saber-toothed cat, this is probably the type of animal that most of you are thinking of. So here is a cast of a skull of the saber-toothed cat Smilodon. And Smilodon lived during the Ice Age and a little bit before then. And so you can see this is a very large skull, right? Even compared to my skull, that's a big skull. This is a big lion to tiger-sized saber-toothed cat that went around feeding on bison and maybe mammoths and mastodons. And it has these giant teeth, right? That's where they get their name from, these big saber teeth. And what I can do here is I can take his lower jaw off and set it off to the side. And then there's a little pin in here that I can pull out, in theory. Whoop. Which then allows me to remove one of his upper teeth. So here we have a saber tooth from a cat. All right, so it's big and long, much larger and longer than a normal cat tooth. But you'll also notice if I turn it on this side, look at how thin that is. All right, they're very much like a steak knife. I've got a knife over here for comparison. Again, very long, but then you turn it on its side and it's very thin, right? So these are very blade-like teeth, and that's where the name saber-tooth comes from, a saber like a sword. So here was our saber-toothed cat again. Big tiger-sized saber-toothed cat. This is Smilodon. And then that tooth that I was showing you, that's this guy right here. You see how big this tooth is? Nice, long, and recurved. But then we turn it on its side, and you can see how thin that is. All right? So this type of saber-toothed cat, Smilodon, is one of our Marcaridontians. So they're very closely related to living cats. All right? So lions and tigers and animals like that. So here is a little house cat skull. So if you have a cat at home, this is what his skull or her skull inside looks like. You see very small little canines, those pointy teeth in the front. Look how much bigger saber-toothed cat canines are. So there's a second group of saber-toothed cats called the BARBOUROFELIDEs, and they lived about 20 million to 11 million years ago. And I don't have a copy of one of their skulls to show you, but they're somewhat similar to the skull of Smilodon that I showed you. They're also very large animals, big, powerful animals. But now there is a third group of saber-toothed cats that lived even earlier than both the Marcarodontines and the BARBOUROFELIDEs. And those animals are known as the NIMRAVIDEs. NIMRAVIDEs lived about 40 to 23 million years ago. And while they are more closely related to cats than they are to dogs, they're all the way down on the bottom of the cat evolutionary tree. So you can see, here's our NIMRAVIDEs over here. Here's our cats. Here's the Marcarodontines, the BARBOUROFELIDEs, and then the NIMRAVIDEs are way down here. So if we connect them back up in an evolutionary tree, they connect way down here at the base. So they're distantly related to cats, but they're still more closely related to cats than the dogs. And it's the NIMRAVIDEs that I want to talk to you about more today in today's talk, these oldest saber-toothed cats. So in North Dakota here, we have a group of rocks called the White River Group, which you can also find through a lot of the middle portion of the United States and a little bit up into Canada. These rocks, these are the 40 to 23 million year old rocks. And these are the rocks that we find saber-toothed cats in. And it turns out that the specimens we're finding had some really interesting features preserved on them that we weren't quite expecting. So to start with, I want to start with one of the most iconic NIMRAVID saber-toothed cats, and that's a cat called Hoplophoneus. And I have a copy of Hoplophoneus right here. Here's Hoplophoneus. So you can see again those really big long saber teeth that in front view are very thin and narrow. Let me jump that, and you can see it on the image here as well. This is Hoplophoneus, big long saber teeth coming down. And the name Hoplophoneus, if you translate it back to the original Latin, means murderous weapon. And that name is in reference to those big saber teeth. So they're named for their teeth. And it turns out that that is probably an actually really apt name for these animals, because it turns out that not only were they going around and attacking their food items like you would expect. So here's a NIMRAVID that's chasing after a small, early camel-like animal called a protosaurid. Some NIMRAVIDs would chase down their prey and tackle them and kill them and eat them there. Other ones would kind of hide in ambush and jump out and attack the prey when they weren't expecting it. But usually when we think about what saber-toothed cats are doing, it's they're attacking the prey items. And it turns out that they were using these big saber teeth not just to attack their prey animals, but also potentially to attack each other. And that's what I want to talk about in a little more detail today, is our evidence for saber-toothed cats, the NIMRAVID saber-toothed cats, fighting amongst themselves. So it turns out that even though saber-toothed cats, these NIMRAVIDs, were one of the main predators at this time, they weren't the biggest predators around, what we would call the apex predator. The apex predators are the predators way at the top that no one really messes with. There were a few other types of predators around that were either about the same size as these NIMRAVIDs or larger and would have been more dominant above them. And we do have some specimens of NIMRAVIDs that show attacks from some of these animals. So to start with, there's an animal called Hyaenodon. So here's a cast of a Hyaenodon skull. This is actually a very small Hyaenodon specimen. They can get very large, over twice as long as this, but this one's a little bit easier to show. Now what you can see on this Hyaenodon skull is if I turn it like this, and I'm going to drop out of screen sharing real quick and go back to just me. All right. They have these very sharp blade-like teeth where their molars go, and they use that for shearing meat off. That cats have a very similar tooth structure. They have these very shearing type molars and premolars that we call carnassials. So the carnassials are used like a pair of scissors. The upper and lower teeth come together and they just snip right through meat. All right. But you'll notice on this Hyaenodon that these canines, their upper large teeth that in saber-toothed cats are those big blades, they're much smaller and they're more round in cross section. So they're almost like a pencil. All right. So if we see something that's been bitten by Hyaenodon, if we take, for example, a piece of clay and we take a relatively round instrument and poke it into that clay, you can see it's going to make a nice round puncture there, right? So if I put a pair of these, that's like the two upper canines coming down and puncturing into the clay. So if we had an animal that was attacked and bitten by hyenodon and it left marks on the bone, this is what we would expect to see, is this kind of double circular puncture mark. And it turns out that we do have a specimen here at the North Dakota Geological Survey that shows these punctures. It's this specimen right here. It's a specimen of a species called Dinictus. This is its skull. The front is over here. This is where its eye would be, right there. And you can see that there's this series. Yeah, somebody's got their mic on. If you can mute your mic, that would be great. You can see this series of punctures here. If we zoom in on them, you can see that they're nice and circular punctures. So this was a saber-toothed cat that had a really bad day and got on the wrong side of a hyenodon individual and got into a fight or got attacked. And that hyenodon killed this saber-toothed cat. We know that it killed the saber-toothed cat and didn't just wound it because there's no evidence on these bites of any type of healing. So the animal didn't live long enough afterwards to heal back up those bites and continue living its life. This was a fatal attack. So that's what it looks like when a hyenodon attacks a saber-toothed cat. We also have another large predator that's around at this time that's called Archatherium. These are giant pig-like animals that lived at this time that were probably the main apex predator. Archatherium, unlike our saber-toothed cats and our hyenodontid, they don't have those shearing type teeth that they can use like scissors to snip off meat from their prey animals. Instead, what they have are big flat crushing teeth. So this is the skull of Archatherium. It's a little crushed, but his eye would be right over here where my thumb is at right there. And then the front of his skull is towards my head right here. And if we look down on the teeth, look at these big, broad, flat crushing teeth. So these teeth aren't meant to very neatly slice off meat and food like that. These teeth are meant to crush bone and just chomp things up into little pieces small enough for it to swallow them. So this is going to look very different on a specimen that's been eaten by Archatherium than those nice circular punctures that we saw from hyenodon. And it turns out that we can see that as well in the fossil record. There is a specimen at the museum down in South Dakota, the Museum of Geology at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, that has these, it's this skull right here. Again, front is over this side over here. Here's where its eye would be, but you can see the skull looks kind of strange and kind of distorted. And that's because if you look at it up close, once it's cleaned up, you can see these big, broad, flat crushes, and the whole skull has been kind of crushed almost flat. And so this is probably an attack from an Archatherium that took this saber-toothed cat in its jaws and just crushed it almost flat. So that's what we would expect to see when an Archatherium attacks a saber-toothed cat. But what would we expect to see when a saber-toothed cat attacks another saber-toothed cat? Well, it turns out there is a documented report of this previously. This skull here, which is also at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, is a specimen of a saber-toothed cat called NIMRAVIDAE. And you can see on the skull roof right here, look at that long, narrow mark on the top of the skull. See that long, narrow mark across the top? And that is a mark made from the tooth of another saber-toothed cat. So if we go back to the clay real quick, if I take this clay and I've got a very knife-like tooth and I puncture that clay, look at that long, narrow mark that saber-tooth-like instrument makes on the clay. It's going to make a very long but narrow mark. And that's what we see on that specimen, is a long, narrow mark on the skull. So this is a cast of that skull I just showed you a photo of, and there is that long, narrow mark across the top of the skull. So this is an attack from another saber-toothed cat. So this guy was going along, just minding his own business, got into a fight with another saber-toothed cat, and that saber-toothed cat just put that tooth right into the top of its head. And the question is, how did that actually happen? Were they fighting face to face? Was it ambushed? Was there some other situation? And that's one of the questions that we're going to look at today. There's also a specimen at the university down in Nebraska in display in their geology museum that shows potentially another attack from a saber-toothed cat. And that is this specimen here. You can see this skull. Again, here's the front of the skull. Here's where the eye goes. And you can see on this mirror in the back, this is an upper arm bone from a saber-toothed cat. And look how that tooth is punctured right through that upper arm bone. And some people have suggested that that was caused from these two saber cats fighting each other, and the specimen represented by the skull bit the other one in the arm and then got its tooth stuck, and both of them ended up dying. Now, other people have suggested that that arm bone was just laying there and the skull ended up sitting on top of it, and over time the pressure just kind of pushed that tooth down through the arm bone, and that's possible. But what's more interesting is the way that this was reconstructed. And you can see the way they reconstructed this attack is as an attack from behind, almost like an ambush, coming and attacking this other saber-toothed cat. And that raises that question that I just mentioned. Which of these interpretations is correct? Are we looking at a situation where, say, one saber-toothed cat has a prey item and another one comes in and wants to take its food from it, and they get in this head-to-head fight, and then eventually one ends up biting the other one in the head? Or is this more like an ambush attack from behind that the one doesn't even know it's coming until the second cat jumps out and attacks it? Or is it a mix of both? And so what we're going to do here today is to solve that question, this murder mystery of what is killing these saber-toothed cats and how are they being killed. So to do this, there's three questions that we're going to look at here real quick. The first is, are these bites common or are they rare? So do we see a lot of them in the fossil record, or is it only one or two specimens? The second question is going to be, are they being attacked from in front where they're facing off against each other, or is one being attacked from behind and being ambushed? And the third question then is, which species of saber-toothed cat is doing these attacks? Are they all doing it to each other, or is there one type that's more likely to be doing it than the other types, and it's kind of like the assassin saber-toothed cat? All right, so to answer this question, we can't just do that with the one or two specimens that I've already showed you. We need to look at more specimens, right? Especially to answer the question of how common is this? If we look at a bunch of saber-toothed cat skulls and we only find one or two at the mark, then it's probably rare. But if we look at a bunch and we start seeing a bunch of these skulls have bite marks, then it's probably a pretty common occurrence. So I want to point out a really interesting specimen, which was found down at Badlands National Park in South Dakota. This is the visitor center that you're looking at here at Badlands National Park in South Dakota. And this little red arrow down here points to the location where a saber-toothed cat skull was found. And what's interesting about this is this was found by a young girl who was on a junior ranger program and just walking along with the group, and kept her eyes really focused and looking at the ground. And as they walked past this area, she was like, you know, excuse me, I think I see something on the ground right here. And the ranger came over and looked at it, and sure enough, it was a saber-toothed cat skull just starting to come out of the rock. So what you can see on this image, this is the back part of the skull, the brain case just starting to come out. This is its cheekbone starting to form right here, starting to come out. And what you see over here by these black arrows, those two little tiny tips, those are the little tips of those canine teeth just starting to poke out of the ground. And that's how she found this skull. Really great job. The important thing is that the fossil's just starting to come out, so it's still in really good shape and we can save a lot of it. And it turned out that after we pulled this skull out of the ground, this is that same skull, that skull had a lot of really interesting information about these saber-toothed cat bites on it. So for one thing, if we look at the one side of the skull, if you look at the back of the skull over here, where I have this blue arrow, there's this big round circular hole punched into the back of it. Now, saber-toothed cats, they've got big blade-like teeth for their upper canines, but in their lower jaw, the lower canines are still nice and round. So this is where the lower jaw punctured into the back of the skull. And by this yellow area, that's where the skull kind of crushed in as it closed its mouth on the skull. And then over here on this side, way down deep in the eye socket, you can see this long slit-like cut down inside the eye. That's the upper canine puncture right there. So that's really cool that we can map out exactly how that bite happened. But it turns out if we look at the other side of the skull then, there's a second bite on the opposite side of the skull. And this time we can see the punctures from both upper canines. So one went inside the eye socket again, and then one just behind the eye socket, as well as that whole cheekbone area got snapped off from the jaws closing. There was so much pressure in that bite, it broke the cheekbone clear off of this specimen. So this is a really great specimen for showing not just one bite, but two really well-developed sets of bites. So then we started looking at, well, let's look not just at new specimens, but what if we go back into the collections and look at some of our older specimens? Can we still see bites on some of these older specimens? So this was one specimen we looked at. This is a specimen of the species Denictus. And you can see this tiny little puncture up above the eye right here on this specimen, but you can see there's been a lot of reconstruction, this brown area where they filled areas back in to make the skull look more complete after they cleaned it. And we asked, well, what happens if we take all that fill-in back off and actually look at why bone was missing in those areas? And it turns out when you do that, now we've reconstructed the missing bone in some places with black clay again instead of the brown clay, but it turns out there's a whole mess of bites across the skull of this cat as well. So again, red arrows for the upper canine punctures, and you can see these long, narrow punctures again around the eye. And here's a nice circular round puncture up at the top of the skull up here from the lower jaw biting on. So here's another bitten cat. And as we went through collections, we just started seeing this again and again and again, that these bites were happening on many, many, many specimens. So bringing us back to the question, our first question of, are these bites common or are they rare? It turns out that these bites are actually fairly common, which means that this was an activity that was happening a lot between saber-toothed cats. There wasn't just at one time, there was one really mean saber-toothed cat that went around and bit a few other cats. This was a common behavior, at least of one type of saber-toothed cat. So moving on to our second question, we're going to try and figure out, are they being attacked from in front or are they being attacked from behind? So if you want to send a message in the chat log to Becky real quick, what do you think? Are they being attacked from in front and they're fighting each other, or are they being ambushed from behind? So send those to Becky, and then when I give the answer, we can look at how people did. So one way that we can look at which way the cats are attacking from is to look, are we seeing the different types of punctures from the lower teeth and the upper teeth in the same areas, or are they kind of all over the skull and the bites are coming from everywhere? So, all right. So if this was a case of two cats fighting each other, then you would expect when one bites the other one, that you would have bites from the upper teeth, maybe somewhere around like this, in this area of the skull, around the eye, or maybe the back of the head. And then if there was punctures from the lower jaw, put that lower jaw back on there. If from the lower jaw would be either on the other one's lower jaw, or say it's biting like this, would be towards the front of the face, right? Whereas if they're being attacked from behind, you'd expect the upper canine punctures to be more towards the front of the skull, as this guy comes over the top and bites him, and then the lower canine punctures would be towards the back of the skull, kind of in this area, as it bites on and uses that as a lever to bite into this guy's face. Okay, so that's two different ways. And if all the attacks are coming from behind, we would expect to see the upper punctures towards the front and the lower punctures towards the back. If they're fighting face to face, then we would expect to see the upper canine punctures towards the back and the lower canine punctures towards the front. If they're doing both, we would just expect to see punctures all over the place and no real pattern. So what we actually see when we look at the specimens is that our lower canine punctures, okay, so here's our lower jaw, are mostly happening on the back of the skull. Okay, so they're either on the very back part right here, or they're up on this area up here. Maybe they're coming from the side and biting over the top. But those lower punctures shown by the blue arrows on this screen are mostly towards the back of the skull. All right, that was interesting. So now when we look at the upper canine punctures, what we see is that most of those are focused around the eye area, either a little bit behind, right at the eye, or a little bit in front, but always more farther in front on the skull than where the lower canine punctures are. All right, so what they're doing is that they're probably trying to attack their opponents and blind them, which is why all of these big marks are around the eyes. And so if we look at that pattern of the lower canine punctures being towards the back of the skull and the upper canine punctures being towards the front of the skull, then what we come up with in terms of whether these animals are being attacked from in front or if they're being ambushed from behind is that these are attacks that are coming from behind. So one saber-toothed cat is ambushing another saber-toothed cat. So they're acting like assassins out there. Maybe they're taking out competitors for mates. Maybe they're taking out competitors for resources, like there's a different species of saber-toothed cat that came into their area and they don't like it and they want to get rid of it and they haven't been able to scare it away, and so then they go in and they ambush it and attack it to get rid of it. But these attacks are all coming from behind. We have no evidence of any of these of it being a front attack, so it's the attack from behind that's more favored. So these are all ambushes. If you look at this screen here, the blue area at the back of the skull indicates where all the lower punctures are, and then the red area at the front of the screen is where all the upper punctures are. So these are clearly ambushes. And this is what we see in living cats as well. Sorry, this slide's not the most fun to look at, but the same thing happens in living cats. When they attack each other, they typically attack each other from behind. And so this is the behavior we would expect saber-toothed cats to show. So one last question that we wanted to answer is, who is the attacker? Who's going around and doing these attacks? And it turns out that we can kind of narrow it down to who is doing these attacks. Now, one thing I haven't told you about yet is what different saber-toothed cats do with their lower jaws. So everybody worries about the upper jaws, but the lower jaws are actually really neat too. So here's two sets of lower jaws from NIMRAVID saber-toothed cats. This is NIMRAVIS here. He has smaller upper canines, but you can see his lower canines are very tall and pointed. They're still very round, but they're tall and pointed and they stick up above the incisors right here, right? Now in Hoplophoneus, which has the really big saber teeth, the lower canines have gotten smaller and they're reduced down to be the same size as the rest of the incisors. So they don't stick up any higher than the teeth next to them. So if we bring our clay back again, if these lower jaws were to bite into something on Hoplophoneus, what you would see is a row of marks from the lower jaw. It's not possible for just the canines to puncture into, say, the bone. All of the teeth would have to puncture the bone. But on animals or species of saber-toothed cats that have the larger lower incisors, when they bite down on something, they can completely puncture into that material with their canines and leave these nice roundish punctures without any of the incisors leaving a mark behind. See, it's a smiley face upside down. So there's a smiley face right side up. See, there's your NIMRAVID smiley face for the day. So if we go and we look at what's actually happening on these cat skulls, we can see that the lower canine is making a nice round circular puncture and there's no other marks next to it. So like I said, Hoplophoneus can't do that, right? Because its incisors and its lower canines are the same height. So this can't be Hoplophoneus that's doing all of these attacks. So that rules out one of our saber-toothed cats. Now there's two other main types of saber-toothed cats that I'm going to focus on. There's a few other species as well, but the two other main types are Dinictis, and you can see Dinictis has slightly larger lower canines. They do stick up a little higher than the incisors next to them. And then there's NIMRAVIS. That was that other lower jaw I showed you, which has very large lower canines, but relatively small upper canines. So either one of those is a possibility. Maybe Dinictis is doing it, maybe NIMRAVIS is doing it. The bite works, but what about the rest of the information that we have about these bites? Well, if we look at NIMRAVIS, NIMRAVIS is probably not the cat we're looking for. And that's because, first of all, that really nice specimen from Badlands National Park I showed you is about 33 million years old. And NIMRAVIS doesn't show up in the fossil record in North America until about 32 million years ago. So it's too young. Now, it could be that we just don't have a full fossil record for NIMRAVIS, and it does make it all the way back. But if I drop out of screen sharing here, I can show you another reason why it's not NIMRAVIS. So say this is our little oblivious cat wandering around having a good day. And here's a specimen of Nimravis, and it wants to come attack it. The problem becomes he has such short little canines that when he tries to bite this guy, that canine can't go all the way down inside the eye and puncture into the bone like we've seen on some of the specimens. His upper canines are just too short. They can't do it. The other bone gets in the way. So it's not possible for Nimravis to make the marks that we're seeing because his canines aren't big enough. Now, alternatively, here is a real specimen of Denictus from our collections. And you can see Denictus doesn't have the massive upper canines that Hoplophoneus does, but they're still bigger than Nimravis, bigger and longer and blade-like. And so that tooth could probably reach down inside the eye socket to make those marks that we're seeing. And remember, Denictus, here's his lower canine. He still does have a relatively tall, round lower canine. So he could make all of the marks that we're seeing on these specimens. So in terms of who is our attacker, Denictus has the right size upper canine and it's the right age. It's the same age as all these other saber cats that we're seeing the bites on. And it turns out then that who is our murderer? More than likely Denictus is our murderer. So if there's a nice little nickname that you want to give to Denictus, Denictus is probably best known then as our assassin saber-tooth cat, which I think we should get trending somewhere. I think assassin saber-tooth cat is probably assassin cat. So that's a nice little moniker. So Catsassin, there we go. So Denictus is a Catsassin. So for whatever reason, Denictus, I don't know if it was really territorial because it's attacking multiple different species of saber-toothed cat, but Denictus was out there just running amok, attacking other cats like crazy, because we see these on a lot of saber-toothed cat skulls. So that's our murder mystery, and you've worked it through with me, all the evidence, and we've gotten through. I will say that a lot of people ask, well, if these cats are biting other cats on their skulls, wouldn't we expect them to damage their teeth? And it turns out they do damage their teeth. Here are some specimens here, and you can see the tips of these teeth have been busted off, and this happened when they were still alive because they've been smoothed back down again afterwards. And then here is one big upper canine that the whole thing has split almost in half, and it lost like half of its upper tooth lengthwise, which had to be really painful. But we do see lots of evidence of these cats breaking their teeth, so there is good evidence on the teeth as well that they're doing this. This specimen here, this is another specimen of Hoplophoneus, the really big saber-toothed cat from South Dakota. And on this cat, these are the upper canines. You're looking at the bottom view of the skull. These are the bases of the upper canines, and they're completely broken off and then worn completely smooth. So this cat broke both of his upper canines and lost them, and then continued to live after that. So he was still able to survive, but probably not hunt quite the same way it used to hunt before. So we do see a lot of evidence in the fossil record that they do break their canines, even though you'd think they'd want to protect them. When it comes down to life or death, things that you wouldn't necessarily do when you're hunting prey animals, when they're hunting their prey, they're mostly biting softer areas like the throat area or the stomach area, things like that. When it comes time to fight a competitor that also wants to hurt you, you're going to use your teeth in ways that you typically wouldn't use them, because it doesn't matter if you break your tooth or not, because if you lose the fight, you're not going to need the teeth anymore anyways. So that was our murder mystery for today. I hope everybody enjoyed it. That ran a little longer than our normal ones, but so we can jump over to answering some questions if people would like. Oh, I'm sure we have questions. So Becky, if you want to feed me some questions.
All right. First off, why do we use modern cats as a good indicator for past environments if the past environments may have been different than modern ones?
So that's a good question. So why do we use modern cats as indicators for environments for extinct cat relatives? Part of it's because that's all we have to work with. We have to learn a little bit about what's around today in order to extrapolate it back to bring it to the past and interpret what's going on. But I will say that we don't just use cats. So in the case of Nimravids, which are somewhat closely related to cats, but are also closely related to things like hyenas and the mongoose, we use all of those different animals. We try to find the animal that has the anatomy that is most similar to our extinct animal and that maybe lived in a similar environment. And then we use that as our model for how to interpret how that extinct animal lived and functioned and what environment it lived in. It's not perfect, and it'll never be perfect. There'll always be parts of the past that we just can't correctly interpret. But this is the best path forward, is to extrapolate back from what we can see today.
How long have you been a paleontologist?
How long have I been a paleontologist? I got my PhD in 2012, so I've officially been a paleontologist for about 8 years now. But before that, I've been doing field work and collecting fossils for over 20 years now. So I've been doing this for quite a while.
How big in inches were Smilodon's teeth?
How big in inches were Smilodon's teeth? Well, that's a good question. Where did I set my Smilodon teeth? Oh, I put it back in the skull. So here's the skull here. Now the important, or the tooth here, the important part to remember is that you're seeing the root and then the crown. The crown is the part that actually sticks up in the mouth. And only this part right here would actually stick up into its mouth. And right there, you're looking at, I don't know, maybe 5 inches?
Right there is like 6 inches.
Yeah, 5 to 6 inches. So still pretty sizable. That's about what we see from decent sized T-Rex specimens, is about 6 inches.
Yeah, in front of that is like 8 to 10.
Yeah. So the whole thing is maybe 8 to 10, but the part that would actually stick up in the mouth, maybe 5 to 6. And remember, Smilodon is one of our really big guys. On these smaller, like NIMRAVIDE saber-tooths, his teeth are only maybe 1.5 inches to 2 inches. They're pretty small by comparison, but they're much bigger than our house cat's teeth, which has probably less than 1 inch of a canine. So that's the thing, is when we call something a saber-tooth, it's all relative to what the standard cat condition is. And some of them are a little bit saber-tooth, and some of them are really over the top crazy saber-tooth. So
How sharp are their teeth?
how sharp are their teeth? The teeth don't have like a knife edge on them. Like if you have a really, really sharp knife, you know, where you can bring it along and like just barely touch a piece of paper and it'll cut through it. It's not sharp in that terms, but the teeth are serrated. So they've got little bumps along the edges. And so if you think of like a steak knife that's got all the little bumps along it, those little bumps help to tear at flesh as it's cutting through. So they're not sharp in the same way that like a really sharp pocket knife is, but they are really, really, really good for cutting and slicing through meat.
How big can they grow and how old could they live?
How big can they grow and how old can they live? So depending on what type of saber-toothed cat we're talking about, this here, this is one of our NIMRAVIDE saber-toothed cats. And at their largest, they tend to get about the size of a mountain lion. A lot of them are smaller. There are some species down to the size of a bobcat or a really big house cat. So the NIMRAVIDEs are not really super big saber-toothed cats. Now, if we go back to Smilodon, so our Marcaridontine saber-toothed cat, these guys are big. These are, you know, big lion to tiger sized. So if you think about a big Siberian tiger that you see at the zoo, that's about the size of Smilodon. So they run that full range from almost house cat size all the way up to big tiger size. As far as how long they live, I'm sure it was different for the different types of saber-toothed cats, but I don't know if there's been good studies that have shown like this one lived for 5 years and then died, or this one lived for 12 years and then died. Probably I would guess somewhere around the range of 10 to 12 years for the bigger cats, but the smaller cats, just like smaller pets that we have at home, can live for longer, could maybe live for 15 or 20 years. But that's in good environments. You have to remember that these things are living harsh lives where they have to worry about getting food all the time and getting attacked. And so while they might have a certain maximum lifespan, most of them are probably living for a lot less than that because they end up just not finding enough food or getting attacked by a competitor and have a much shorter life.
How far can they open their mouths?
How far can they open their mouth? That is a great question, and why I'm glad I've got these casts here. All right, so if we start with not a cat, okay, here's our hyenodon skull again, right? This is just going to give us a point of comparison. So this hyenodon can maybe open his jaw up about like that. Let me make sure I got my jaws in the right spot. About like that, okay? Which is still kind of wide, but it's not super wide, right? At that point, the bones at the back of the lower jaw and the back of the skull come into contact with each other, and it keeps them from overextending and breaking their lower jaw when they're biting things. Now, in a saber-toothed cat, though, the setup is much different. especially if we have one of the forms that has really big saber teeth, right? If they could only open their mouth a little bit, how would they get food into their mouth, right? Because those teeth are still in the way. So it turns out what they do is they reduce this area on the back of the lower jaw, and then also the little prong that's at the back of the skull that normally gets in the way from opening your mouth really wide. And so if we put this in here, they can, there we go, they can really open their mouths. So you can see there, almost 90 degrees, maybe a little longer in there, and that gives them the space they need to get food in their mouth and around those big teeth. So they probably weren't doing that all the time. They're probably not walking around like this, right? But at the spur of the moment when they need to eat something, they can open real wide, grab their food, and then close their mouth up again, and then maybe do a little chewing, but cats don't do a lot of chewing. They mostly slice their meat off and then swallow it down.
Why did they go extinct?
Why did they go extinct? That's a great question. Now, animals like Smilodon that lived much more recently and went extinct at the end of the Ice Age, there's some question about whether or not humans might have been related to them going extinct. Think about it. Would you want a big tiger-sized saber-toothed animal running around your backyard all the time? That's kind of scary. And in the same way that a lot of other large predators at the end of the Ice Age went extinct, like the big short-faced bears and the dire wolves, humans could have had some role in that, but the environment also was changing very quickly at the end of the Ice Age, and they just might not have been adapted to living in the world that we have now. They were better in a colder, drier planet. Now, the Nimravids, the older guys, which go extinct about 20 million years ago, that's a really good question because there's nothing that directly outcompetes them. They just seem to be really abundant and diverse for a while, and then slowly kind of thin down their diversity as it goes through. Now, at that same time, we do see a really big explosion in the diversity of different dogs. So many, many dog species are evolving and filling all different sorts of roles. And it could be just that at about 20 million years ago, 20 to 25 million years ago, dogs were really successful and they outcompeted a lot of these types of cats, and a lot of those cat species went extinct, and the dogs kind of dominated for a while. So that could be why those older ones went extinct.
How fast are they, and could they swim?
How fast are they, and could they swim? Different species of saber-toothed cats were built for different things. Some of them were probably kind of fast, not cheetah fast, but enough to do little sprints to go after food. They had kind of longer, narrower limbs that were meant for that type of work. Other saber-toothed cats were big and bulky and probably couldn't chase things down at all, and so they were probably more ambush type animals. So we're probably seeing a little bit of both. Some of them were probably really slow, and some of them were a little speedy, but by speedy, I mean we're talking about like lion speedy, not cheetah speedy, not 60 miles an hour across the plains. What was the second part of the question?
Can they swim?
Can they swim? Well, most animals can swim. It's just a matter of whether they want to swim or not, or if they only do it when they really have to. Even modern cats, if they go into water, they typically don't like it, but they can still swim pretty decently if they do it. So probably these saber-toothed cats could swim. I would guess it wasn't something that they were doing very often, though.
Hoplophonia skull, what is the extra big bone in the chin?
Ah, good point there. On the Hoplophonia skull, they're asking what is going on with the chin area of the lower jaw. So here's the lower jaw, right? It's coming along nice and normal. Let me grab the hyenodon real quick for comparison. So this is what we would expect a lower jaw to look like. It's relatively similar to what your lower jaw looks like, relatively flat or rounded along the bottom, and then comes up to where the teeth are at. On these saber-toothed cats, they've got this big, what's called a flange at the front down here that comes down and makes the front part really deep, and it does it on both sides. You can see if I look from the front, so you're looking right at the front, it does it on both sides. And what those areas are is they match up with exactly where those upper canines slide down into. You can see that the canines slot right into there. And so what it's thought is that these flanges on the lower jaw, these are to protect the canines, because these canines, look at how thin they are. Say this guy's walking around and one of his friends is walking next to him and just kind of accidentally stumbles into him and hits his tooth from the side. these teeth are so thin that an impact from the side could snap them right. Should I do that? You think Jeff would like that if I give it? No, no, we're not going to do that. But if you hit the side of it, they would snap really easily. So instead, what they did is they had kind of these built-in sheaths that their teeth would go into that would protect them. So now that cat can get hit from the side, but that lower jaw keeps that tooth from getting bent too far in one direction, and it acts as a protection. It also acts as a protection for when it lays down like it's going to go to sleep. Instead of it laying down and its lower jaw or its upper teeth kind of puncturing down into the dirt, that lower jaw would sit below it and keep those teeth from going down into the dirt. And so these are mostly for protection of these teeth here. And so probably when these guys were walking around, most of what they were doing was only opening their mouths a little bit to keep their teeth nice and sheathed and protected, until the moment when they had to attack something, where they would open up their mouths really wide, kind of like drawing your sword out. They would draw their swords out and attack, and then as soon as that was over, they'd put them away again. Okay, so question about whether or not these saber-toothed cats were living by themselves or were they living in prides like lions or big social groups. We don't have really great evidence for that. Behavior is hard to fossilize and hard for us to interpret from the fossil record. However, there are some specimens of saber-toothed cats, both Smilodon, there's an example in Smilodon, and then also that really nice saber-toothed cat that I showed you from Badlands National Park, that NIMRAVIDE. In both of those areas, there are evidence that these cats earlier in their life were really badly injured to where it would have been difficult to take care of themselves or get food for themselves, and yet they still managed to heal that injury and live for longer. That specimen from Badlands National Park, the Hoplophonius NIMRAVIDE, it broke its back bad enough that its back got shifted and offset. And if you break your back like that, it's hard to even stand, let alone chase down food. And yet that cat lived for long enough that that broken vertebra re-healed back together in this big gnarly mass so it could then stand and walk again. And there's a question of whether or not an animal that was just living by itself could survive for long enough without being able to get food to re-heal the bones like that, or is it living in a type of setup where other cats were maybe bringing it food until it healed enough to get back on its feet and contribute to the group again. So there is maybe some evidence that they were a little bit social, but we're not entirely sure if it was like a big social group, or was it like lions with a pride where there's maybe one male and a bunch of females living together, and then the other males get kind of kicked off to the side. We're just not certain on that yet.
Were Archaeotherium related to wildebeest?
Were Archaeotherium related to wildebeest? Archaeotherium, let me grab his skull again.
Gently.
Yep. This is a real skull, so I got to be careful with it because we don't want to break it. But Archaeotherium actually belongs to an entire group called the Entelodonts, and the Entelodonts are completely extinct. So there are no direct relatives of Archaeotherium. They're kind of a little bit closely related to pigs and other pig-like animals, so not so much to wildebeest, but more like suids, like pigs and things like that. But it has no direct relatives. Nothing that's alive today can we trace directly back to Archaeotherium, unfortunately. And these animals get really big. This is kind of a medium-sized one for this time period, but when you get into the Miocene, about 15 million years ago, these skulls get like 4 feet long. These are big, giant predators at that time, but they get so big that eventually when the climate starts changing again, they can't adapt, and they need so much food because they're so large that they end up going extinct, and that's why we lose these Entelodons. But they are pretty impressive animals.
If you found just a tooth, how do you know what tooth goes with what kind of saber-toothed cat?
So if we find just a tooth, how do we know which saber-toothed cat we're looking at? Well, first of all, if we know where the tooth came from and we know the age of those rocks, we can narrow it down to one of the 3 groups of saber-toothed cats because they all lived at different times. So if we find something in like Ice Age sediments left by a glacier, that's probably a Marcarodontine, something like Smilodon. If it's a little bit older, say about 15 to 20 million years ago, and it's a really big tooth, that's probably our Barbourofelidae, which we didn't talk about too much, but we introduced them at the beginning. If it's even older than that, like 25 to 40 million years ago, then we're in the age range that we're dealing with the NIMRAVIDEs. the smaller saber-toothed cats that we talked about most today. Beyond that, we can look at the size. Say it's an upper canine, you can look at the size. It's like I said, Hoplophoneus, big giant upper canines, Nimravis, very small upper canines, Denictus is kind of in the middle. But at that point, you're mostly going to be making a guess, because when these guys are babies, these big saber-toothed cats are babies, they have baby saber teeth that come in first and then eventually get dropped and replaced by the adult teeth. And those baby saber-tooth teeth on Hoplophoneus actually look a lot like Denictus adult teeth. So if you find a tooth, it can be hard to tell, is this a baby Hoplophoneus tooth or is this an adult Denictus tooth? So some of the molars, so they're molars right here, these big bladed ones that they use for cutting and slicing, these can be a little more diagnostic. Diagnostic means that when we find them, we can really tell what animal it comes from. So these molars can be a little more diagnostic because they've got special little bumps and what we call cusps, so little features on the tooth that are very specific to different species. But otherwise, you really do kind of need a more complete specimen, like at least a full skull, in order to tell exactly what species you're dealing with. Otherwise, like what Becky and I do is we'll find a tooth, and the most we can say is, well, this comes from a Nimravid saber-tooth, but we can't identify it any more than that. And we just have to hope that maybe there's more of that specimen around that we can put back together and get a better idea of what animal we're dealing with. What color were they? We have no idea. There's no good specimens that preserve like skin or hair or anything like that for most of these Nimravids. There may be a little bit, although I've never heard of, like they find the lion cubs from the Ice Age that are well preserved, but I've never heard about that for Nimravids though, or not Nimravids, but Marcaridontine saber-toothed cats. So as far as I know, we have no direct evidence of what these animals look like. And if you look at modern cats and hyenas and mongoose, they've got all different types of patterns and colors. So really, we can make a guess, but we're all just guessing. So they could be really bland and maybe they're just all gray or all brown, or maybe they had really startling patterns like a clouded leopard across them. Everything is possible. We just don't have the evidence for it.
How strong were their jaw muscles?
How strong were their jaw muscles? Their jaw muscles are actually not all that strong. Grab my. So if we go back to Hoplophoneus here at least, so another way that they would protect these upper teeth is they're doing less of like biting onto something and then closing their jaws really, really hard like an alligator. Like think about how fast an alligator can snap its mouth closed. It has really strong jaws. Yeah, I see someone doing it there. Snap. Really strong jaws for closing their mouth, not really strong jaws for opening their mouth, which is why you can hold an alligator's mouth closed. Do not do that on your own. I am not advocating anybody to hold an alligator's mouth closed, but someone who knows what they're doing can hold an alligator's mouth closed. On these cats, instead, what is thought to happen is when they first bite onto an animal, let's say he's biting my arm. This is a big fear of mine, is for a Nimravid to bite my arm. Thankfully, I don't have to actually worry about it, but we're going to practice it here. Is they would bite first with their lower jaw, and they would lock those lower teeth in, okay? And then these saber-toothed cats had really strong neck muscles, especially on the top of the neck right here, okay? And what that would allow them to do is once they'd anchored that lower jaw into flesh or bone, then they would kind of use their neck to slam the top part of their head down and close their mouth. So they're less using their jaw muscles to completely close their jaws than they are using their neck muscles to really slam that upper part of their skull down and sink those big upper teeth in. And then once it's closed, it's a little easier to hold your mouth closed because your neck has done that snapping closed motion for you. One way that we look at that on animals to tell how strong their jaws are is to look at this area right through here. This is a really big area where the muscles attached to, sorry, I'm off the screen. This area here on the lower jaw. And you can see it doesn't have that big of a process on the lower jaw. And then you also want to look at this area up here on the skull. And animals that have a really strong bite, they tend to have a big ridge that sticks up off the top, which creates a really big area for those muscles to attach to, which makes them really strong, gives them good lever action. And we just don't see that. We see a little bit of that, but we don't see like really insanely strong jaws on a saber-toothed cat. So it was more that snapping neck action, but even so, they don't have to have really super strong jaws. They just have to sink those teeth in and then just hold after that. It's my favorite thing that I've dug up. Ooh, what's my favorite thing that I've dug up? Wow, we do so much. It's hard to remember all of it and so many different types of animals. I did help collect an almost complete, about 80% complete duck-billed dinosaur species called Edmontosaurus, which had some skin impressions preserved with it. That was really cool. It even had the inner ear bones still in place. And there's a set of bones called the hyoid bones, which helps support your tongue. It still had those hyoid bones in place. So I'd have to say that's probably my favorite specimen I ever dug up, just because of how complete it was and how interesting all the features were.
Why did they fight each other, and did they fight over females?
Why did saber-toothed cats fight each other, and were they fighting over females? It's possible they're fighting over females. It could be that maybe the animal that's getting attacked is at the head of a pride, if they had a pride structure and it's the dominant male, say, for example, and then another male wants to take over that pride and comes and sneaks up on it and attacks it and takes it out so it can take its place. Or it could be that the dominant male is going around and chasing off all the other males to keep it away from its females. And then every once in a while, it gets a really persistent one that won't go away, and it ends up having to ambush and kill it. Or it could just be that they weren't living in like a pack structure or a pride structure, and they're living by themselves, and they just didn't like other saber-toothed cats around, especially different species of saber-toothed cats. You know, maybe say if you're a wolf, maybe you'll tolerate other wolves coming in now and then. You'll chase them off, but you know, this is my territory, but we're all wolves. We're going to kind of get along. But then you see a coyote has wandered into your area. Well, I'm not putting up with that coyote being here. I'm going to take that coyote out. Maybe that's what the saber-toothed cats were doing. Maybe Dinictus is going around and kind of being like, oh, I'll put up with a Dinictus or two now and then. But then it sees Hoplophonius, and it's like, that is just a direct competitor, and it does me no good to leave him around here. I'm going to go take him out, and they go and attack it. So there's a few different ways that these attacks could be happening, and it could be for more than one reason. But all we know is that they were clearly doing it for some reason. Okay, so that's all we've got time for today. If you've got more questions, you can always go to our Discord server. So we've got a page on Discord, which is NDGS Paleo on there. Do we have a link to it on the Facebook page? Link on the Facebook page. There are some forums in there. One of them is titled Saber-toothed Cats. You can go in there and post any other questions you have. Becky and I go in there regularly and we'll answer your questions. We'll post some cool photos in there, show you all sorts of different stuff. There's also our Facebook page. On all the social media platforms, we are at NDGS Paleo. So follow us there. For tomorrow, we are going to bring back the wonderful Becky Barnes, and she will be presenting on amber. So we'll be talking about different fossils that you can find in amber, different ways that amber forms, different ages of amber, all sorts of stuff about amber. So make sure you get your amber questions all put together and ready for tomorrow. And we'll meet you all back here again at 10 a.m. Central Time for chatting with NDGS Paleo. Otherwise, thank you everybody who joined us today. We hope you keep coming back. We're glad that this is useful for people, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.